Chapter 3, Psychologism, its arguments and its attitude to the usual counter-arguments. 17. The disputed question as to whether the essential theoretical foundations of normative logic lie in psychology. If we now apply the general results arrived at in the last chapter to logic as a normative discipline, a first, very weighty question arises, which theoretical sciences provide the essential foundations of the theory of science. And to this we forthwith add the further question, is it correct that the theoretical truths we find dealt with in the framework of traditional and modern logic, and above all those belonging to its essential foundations, have their theoretical place in the sciences that have been already marked off and independently developed? Here we encounter the disputed question as to the relation between psychology and logic, since one dominant tendency of our time has already answered to the questions raised. The essential theoretical foundations of logic lie in psychology, in whose field those propositions belong, as far as their theoretical content is concerned, which give logic its characteristic pattern. Logic is related to psychology just as any branch of chemical technology is related to chemistry, as land surveying is to geometry, etc. This tendency sees no need to mark off a new theoretical discipline, and, in particular, not one that would deserve the name of logic in a narrow and more pointed sense. Often people talk as if psychology provided the sole, sufficient, theoretical foundation for logical technology. So we read in Mill's polemic against Hamilton, logic is not a science separate from and coordinate with psychology. To the extent that it is a science at all, it is a part or branch of psychology, distinguished from it on the one hand as the part is from the whole, and on the other hand as the art is from the science. It owes all its theoretical foundations to psychology, and includes as much of that science as is necessary to establish the rules of the art. An examination of Sir William Hamilton's philosophy, p. 461. According to Lopes, it even seems that logic is to be ranked as a mere constituent of psychology, for he says, the fact that logic is a specific discipline of psychology distinguishes them satisfactorily from one another. Lopes, Grundzüge der Logik, 1893, 3. 18. The line of proof of the psychologistic thinkers. If we ask for the justification of such views, a most plausible line of argument is offered, which seems to cut off all further dispute ab initio. However, one may define logic as a technology of thinking, judging, inferring, knowing, proving, of the courses followed by the understanding in the pursuit of truth, in the evaluation of grounds of proof, etc. We find invariably that mental activities or products are the objects of practical regulation. And just as, in general, the artificial working over of a material presupposes the knowledge of its properties, so this will be the case here too, where we are specially concerned with psychological material. The scientific investigation of the rules according to which this stuff should be worked over, naturally leads back to the scientific investigation of these properties. Psychology therefore provides the theoretical basis for constructing a logical technology, and, more particularly, the psychology of cognition. To any glance at the contents of logical literature will confirm this. What is being talked of throughout? Concepts, judgments, syllogisms, deductions, inductions, definitions, classifications, etc., all psychology, except that they are selected and arranged from normative and practical points of view. Draw the bounds of pure logic as tightly as one likes, it will not be possible to keep out what is psychological. This is implicit in the concepts constitutive for logical laws, truth and falsehood, affirmation and negation, universality and particularity, ground and consequent, etc. 19. The usual arguments of the opposition and the psychologistic rejoinder. Remarkably enough, the opposition believes that it can base a sharp separation of the two disciplines on precisely the normative character of logic. Psychology, it is said, deals with thinking as it is, logic with thinking as it should be. The former has to do with the natural laws, the latter with the normative laws of thinking. It reads in this sense in Jask's version of Kant's lectures on logic. Some logicians presuppose psychological principles for logic, but to introduce such principles into logic is as absurd as to derive morality from life. If we take principles from psychology, i.e. from observations of our understanding, we shall only see how thought proceeds, and what happens under manifold subjective hindrances and conditions. Those would only lead to a knowledge of merely contingent laws. Logic does not however ask after contingent, but after necessary laws, not how we think but how we ought to think. The rules of logic must therefore be taken, not from the contingent, but from the necessary use of reason, which one finds in oneself apart from all psychology. In logic we do not wish to know what the understanding is like and how it thinks, nor how it has hitherto proceeded in its thinking, but how it ought to proceed in its thinking. It should teach us the correct use of the understanding, the use in which it is consistent with itself. Introduction, I concept of logic. Kant's work, E. D. Hartenstein, 1867, 8, p. 14. Herbart takes up a similar position when he objects to the logic of his time and the would-be psychological stories about understanding and reason with which it starts, by saying that this is as badly in error as a moral theory which tried to begin with the natural history of human tendencies, urges and weaknesses, and by pointing to the normative character of logic as of ethics. Herbart, Psychologie als Wissenschaft, 2, 119, original ed. 2, p. 173. Such arguments do not dismay the psychologistic logicians. They answer, a necessary use of the understanding is none the less a use of the understanding, and belongs, with the understanding itself, to psychology. Thinking as it should be, is merely a special case of thinking as it is. Psychology must certainly investigate the natural laws of thinking, the laws which hold for all judgments whatever, whether correct or false. It would, however, be absurd to interpret this proposition as if such laws only were psychological as applied with the most embracing generality to all judgments whatever, whereas special laws of judgment, like the laws of correct judgment, were shut out from its purview. Compare, for example, Mill, An Examination, p. 459f, or does one hold a different opinion? Can one deny that the normative laws of thinking have the character of such special laws? This also will not do. Normative laws of thought, it is said, only try to say how one must proceed provided one wants to think correctly. We think correctly, in the material sense, when we think of things as they are. But for us to say, certainly and indubitably, that things are like this or like that, means that the nature of our mind prevents us from thinking of them otherwise. For one need not repeat what has been so often uttered, that one can obviously not think of a thing as it is, without regard to the way in which one must think of it, nor can one make of it so isolated an object of knowledge. The man, therefore, who compares his thought of things with the things themselves can in fact only measure his contingent thinking, influenced by custom, tradition, inclination and aversion, against a thinking that is free from such influences, and that heeds no voice but that of its own inherent lawfulness. The rules, therefore, on which one must proceed in order to think rightly are merely rules on which one must proceed in order to think as the nature of thought, its specific lawfulness, demands. They are, in short, identical with the natural laws of thinking itself. Logic is a physics of thinking or it is nothing at all. Lopes, Die Aufgabe der Erkenntnistheorie, Verlass. Monachef, 16, I 880, B 530F. It may perhaps be said from the anti-psychologistic side 3 of course the various kinds of presentations, judgments, syllogisms etc. also have a place in psychology as mental phenomena and dispositions, but psychology has a different task in regard to them than logic. Both investigate the laws of these activities, but law means something quite different in the two cases. The task of psychology is to investigate the laws governing the real connections of mental events with one another, as well as with related mental dispositions and corresponding events in the bodily organism. Law here means a comprehensive formula covering coexistent and successive connections that are without exception and necessary. Such connections are causal. The task of logic is quite different. It does not inquire into the causal origins or consequences of intellectual activities, but into their truth content. It inquires what such activities should be like, or how they should proceed, in order that the resultant judgments should be true. Correct judgments and false ones, evident ones and blind ones, come and go according to natural laws. They have causal antecedents and consequences like all mental phenomena. Such natural connections do not, however, interest the logician. He looks rather for ideal connections that he does not always find realized, in fact only exceptionally finds realized in the actual course of thoughts. He aims not at a physics, but an ethics of thinking. Sigwart therefore rightly stresses the point that, in the psychological treatment of thought, the opposition of true and false has as little part to play as the opposition of good or bad in human conduct is a psychological matter. For we cannot be content, such will be the psychologistic rejoinder, with such half-truths. The task of logic is of course quite different from that of psychology, who would deny it. It is a technology of knowledge, but how could such a technology ignore questions of causal connection? How could it look for ideal connections without studying natural ones? As if every ought did not rest on an is, every ethics did not also have to show itself a physics. Lupes, Die Aufgabe der Erkenntnis Theory, Opsit p. 529. A question as to what should be done always reduces to a question as to what must be done if a definite goal is to be reached, and this question in its term is equivalent to a question as to how this goal is in fact reached. Lupes, Grundzüge der Logik, 1. That psychology, as distinct from logic, does not deal with the opposition of true and false does not mean that psychology treats these different mental conditions on a like footing, but that it renders both intelligible in a like manner. Lupes, Opsit 3, p. 2. Theoretically regarded, logic therefore is related to psychology as a part to a whole. Its main aim is, in particular, to set up propositions of the form, our intellectual activities must, either generally, or in specifically characterized circumstances, have such and such a form, such and such an arrangement, such and such combinations and no others, if the resultant judgments are to have the character of evidence, are to achieve knowledge in the pointed sense of the word. Here we have an obvious causal relation. The psychological character of evidence is a causal consequence of certain antecedents. What sort of antecedents? This is just what we have to explore. 5. The following often repeated argument is no more successful in shaking the psychologistic ranks. Logic, it is said, can as little rest on psychology as on any other science, since each science is only a science in virtue of its harmony with logical rules. It presupposes the validity of these rules. It would therefore be circular to try to give logic a first foundation in psychology. 6. The opposition will reply that this argument cannot be right, is shown by the fact that it would prove the impossibility of all logic. Since logic itself must proceed logically, it would itself commit the same circle, would itself have to establish the validity of rules that it presupposes. Let us, however, consider more closely what such a circle could consist in. Could it mean that psychology presupposes the validity of logical laws? Here one must notice the equivocation in the notion of presupposing. That a science presupposes the validity of certain rules may mean that they serve as premises in its proofs. It may also mean that they are rules in accordance with which the science must proceed in order to be a science at all. Both are confounded in our argument, for which reasoning according to logical rules, and reasoning from logical rules, count as identical. There would only be a circle if the reasoning were from such rules. But, as many an artist creates beautiful works without the slightest knowledge of aesthetics, so an investigation may construct proofs without ever having recourse to logic. Logical laws cannot therefore have been premises in such proofs. And what is true of single proofs is likewise true of whole sciences. 20. A gap in the psychologistic line of proof. In these and similar arguments the anti-psychologistic party seem undoubtedly to have got the worst of it. Many think the battle quite at an end. They regard the rejoinders of the psychologistic party as completely victorious. One thing only might arouse our philosophical wonder, that there was and is such a battle at all, that the same arguments have repeatedly been adduced while their refutations have not been acknowledged as cogent. If everything really were so plain and clear as the psychologistic trend assures us, the matter would not be readily understandable, since there are unprejudiced, serious and penetrating thinkers on the opposite side as well. Is this not again a case where the truth lies in the middle? Has each of the parties not recognized a valid portion of the truth, and only shown incapacity for its sharp conceptual circumscription, and not even seen that they only had part of the whole? Is there not perhaps an unresolved residuum in the arguments of the anti-psychologists, despite much uncleanness and error in detail which has made refutation easy? Are they not informed by a true power, which always re-emerges in unbiased discussion? I for my part would answer yes. It seems to me that the greater weight of truth lies on the anti-psychologistic side, but that its key thoughts have not been properly worked out, and are blemished by many mistakes. Let us go back to the question we raised above regarding the essential foundations of normative logic. Have the arguments of psychologistic thinkers really settled this? Here a weak point at once appears. The argument only proves one thing, that psychology helps in the foundation of logic, not that it has the only or the main part in this, not that it provides logic's essential foundation in the sense above defined. 16. The possibility remains open that another science contributes to its foundation, perhaps in a much more important fashion. Here may be the place for the pure logic which on the other party's view, has an existence independent of all psychology, and is a naturally bounded, internally closed-off science. We readily grant that what Kantians and Herbartians have produced under this rubric does not quite accord with the character that our suggested supposition would give it. For they always talk of normative laws of thinking and particularly of concept formation, judgment framing, etc. Proof enough, one might say, that their subject matter is neither theoretical nor wholly unpsychological. But this objection would lose weight if closer investigation confirmed the surmise suggested to us above in 13, that these schools were unlucky in defining and building up the intended discipline, yet nonetheless approached it closely, insofar as they discerned an abundance of interconnected theoretical truths in traditional logic, which did not fit into psychology, nor into any other separate science, and so permitted one to divine the existence of a peculiar realm of truth. And if these were the truths to which all logical regulation in the last resort related, truths mainly to be thought of when logical truths were in question, one could readily come to see in them what was essential to the whole of logic, and to give the name of pure logic to their theoretical unity. That this hits off the true state of things I hope actually to prove.